Tonight, we shall venture into a realm both intimately familiar and profoundly alien, the world of sleep. More specifically, we will explore the manner in which medieval people slumbered, a practice that proves to be far more peculiar than most of us could ever conceive. If you find these journeys into the past to be a source of enjoyment, I encourage you to express your appreciation. It is always a profound curiosity to learn from which corner of the globe you are listening, and at what hour this narrative reaches you. So now, let the lights grow dim. Perhaps invite the soft hum of a fan to provide a gentle ambience. And together, let us ease into the evening's exploration. In an era preceding the glow of electricity, the endless scroll of social media, and the dictates of sleep hygiene experts, medieval people observed a nightly regimen that would confound the contemporary devotee of melatonin. This practice was known as segmented sleep, a natural biphasic cycle that partitioned the night. As neatly as one might break a hardened medieval biscuit, the routine itself was quite straightforward. Following sunset, the majority of the populace would retire early, surrendering to what they referred to as the first sleep. Then, after a period of approximately 4 hours, they would intentionally awaken to spend the subsequent 1 or 2 hours engaged in what can only be termed medieval midnight multitasking. This interlude was not viewed as a form of insomnia. It was simply the accepted nature of slumber. The watch period between these two sleeps was regarded as a practical, valuable, and at times, a surprisingly communal interval. People would use this time for prayer, for the reading of religious manuscripts, for tending to the embers in the hearth, or for checking on their livestock, because nothing disrupts a REM cycle quite like the anxiety of a missing goat. Furthermore, this was also deemed the most suitable time for marital intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage guides observed that during this period, the body was thoroughly rested and the mind was tranquil, a description that sounds like a courteous way of saying one was too exhausted to quarrel. So, if you have ever considered yourself romantic for rising early to prepare coffee for your partner, be aware that your ancestors established a very different standard. The second sleep would commence after this break, enduring until the first light of dawn. This nightly rhythm was observed by everyone, from sequestered monks to diligent farmers. Even esteemed literary figures like Chaucer made casual reference to it, which confirms that, indeed, even within medieval literature, individuals were writing about their sleep difficulties. Curiously, modern scientific inquiry has indicated that segmented sleep may, in fact, be a more innate pattern for human beings. The dual sleep cycle harmonizes with the natural function of our circadian rhythms when uninfluenced by artificial illumination. Therefore, the next time you find yourself alert and awake at 2 in the morning, do not succumb to panic. Instead, you might whisper, "Ah, the watch has commenced," and proceed to tend to a symbolic fireplace. It was not until the dawn of the industrial era, with its its factories, gas lighting, and a mounting apprehension of unproductivity, that humanity began to impose the notion of 8 uninterrupted hours of rest, as if sleep were some kind of timed athletic event. In the medieval world, awakening in the heart of the night was not a failure. It was the schedule, and everyone adhered to it, whether they wished to or not. Let us discuss the matter of beds, or more accurately, the medieval equivalent of them. In our contemporary world, we fixate on thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress can be described as cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was frequently just an accumulation of materials that were once living, now compressed beneath the weight of fitful sleep and unspoken sorrows. The standard peasant bed was composed of a straw-filled mattress, commonly called a pallet. This was, in essence, straw or hay, packed into a sack of coarse textile, assuming one had the means for such a sack. If not, it was merely a pile of straw upon the floor, which was potentially damp and possibly already occupied by a feline. These pallets were far from comfortable, but they were a significant improvement over nothing, which was the other option. Straw was inexpensive, abundant, and served as effective insulation against the cold. It was also an excellent habitat for insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, transforming sleep into an exercise in cautious immobility. If something caused an itch, you disregarded it. If it delivered a bite, you shifted positions slightly and hoped for a better outcome. Should a family possess a little more wealth, or at least a sturdy back, they might elevate their straw mattress upon a wooden frame. This did not radically alter the quality of sleep, but it did lessen the probability of waking up with a small rodent nesting in one's hair. Blankets were not a common possession, and neither was the concept of personal space. Entire families, children, parents, perhaps a grandparent, all slumbered together in the same area, sometimes upon the very same pile of straw. If one became too warm, one could simply roll into a cousin's elbow. The nobility, naturally, possessed proper beds. These were grand wooden frames adorned with feather mattresses, embroidered linens, and canopies designed to keep out drafts, and with any luck, the lice. These beds were of such value that they were bequeathed in wills. One did not inherit estates. One inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Nevertheless, for the majority of medieval people, a bed was not a sanctuary of comfort. It was a place to avoid freezing, to steer clear of the chickens, and perhaps, just perhaps, to dream of one day being affluent enough to sleep on something that did not squawk or rustle. When we encounter the term nightcap today, we imagine a comforting little beverage, perhaps something containing whiskey, enjoyed by a warm fire alongside a questionable choice. In the Middle Ages, however, a nightcap was not a drink. It was a hat. It was a tangible, often ludicrously shaped piece of cloth intended to prevent one's head from freezing during sleep. You see, insulation was not a notable feature of medieval construction. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows fashioned from thin animal horn old parchment offered scant protection against the cold. As for central heating, that was known as a dog. Consequently, to maintain warmth in their heads at night, particularly since body heat dissipates most rapidly through the scalp, medieval people embraced the unassuming nightcap. These hats appeared in a variety of shapes and sizes, though the most emblematic version was long and pointed, resembling something one might find on a wizard who works part-time as a chimney sweep. They were typically crafted from wool, linen, or any scrap of warm fabric that could be spared without provoking the family goat. For men, it served as a practical item. For women, it sometimes served a secondary function as a coif or head wrap, which also fulfilled the dual roles of preserving modesty and concealing hair that had not been washed since the previous Lenten season. Yet, beyond providing warmth, nightcaps also carried social significance. In certain regions, married women were required to keep their heads covered at all times, yes, even during sleep. The cap itself could be embellished with embroidery or dyed to signify a family's wealth or social standing, because nothing conveys success quite like retiring to bed with a miniature flag upon your skull. In more populated urban areas, the nightcap even evolved into a symbol of being off-duty. If you answered your door while wearing one, it was a courteous, medieval method of communicating. I am not attired for a conversation. And yes, this hat does indeed mean you should depart. Of course, nightcaps were frequently worn with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose-fitting tunics. Imagine Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the haunting moral epiphany. Sleepwear was not intended to be alluring. It was functional, conventional, and entirely non-negotiable. Imagine you are a traveling merchant, a pilgrim on a sacred journey, or simply someone whose mule has given up halfway to Norwich. You locate an inn, a considerable luxury in itself, and request a place to rest. What you are provided is not a private room, or even a private bed, nor a particularly clean patch of floor. What you receive is a space within a bed that is already occupied. Medieval inns functioned more like communal human bunkhouses than contemporary hotels. Privacy was not an expectation. If a bed had available space, you were to share it, typically with total strangers who might snore, speak in their sleep, or possess a concerning number of boils. This arrangement was not deemed impolite. It was simply an efficient allocation of resources. Beds could accommodate 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, contingent on their size and the occupants' social forbearance. In larger cities, you might find yourself in a dormitory-style hall filled with rows of beds and an absolute absence of personal space. Snoring competitions went unjudged. The territory of one's elbows was fiercely defended. On occasion, men and women were segregated, but this was not always the case. Some innkeepers attempted to assign beds based on profession, blacksmiths with other blacksmiths, clergy with fellow clergy, and supposedly thieves with other thieves. More often, however, it was a matter of first come, first sprawled. While this might sound like a nightmare to the modern germaphobe, at that time it was a significant improvement over sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant rebellion. Concerned about theft, many travelers slept with their purses securely tied to their belts or concealed beneath their garments. Others would sleep atop their belongings, turning their luggage into both a pillow and a makeshift security system. If someone attempted to move your bag, it typically signified you were about to awaken in a poorer state. The affluent, of course, were spared this predicament. Nobles journeyed with their own retinues and camped in comparative comfort, or they would demand private rooms if an innkeeper wished to keep their establishment intact. In the medieval world, retiring for the night was not merely about pulling up a blanket and drifting into unconsciousness. It was a spiritual endeavor, a nightly wager with your eternal soul as the prize. People did not simply go to sleep, they prepared for the possibility of death. This is why bedtime prayers were so prevalent. Forget lavender mist or calming audio tracks. Medieval sleepers concluded their day with confessions, psalms, and soul-purifying spiritual clauses, just in case they were to perish somewhere between saying goodnight and the break of dawn. The rationale was straightforward. One could die at any moment from sickness, fire, demonic influence, or most perilously, from being over the age of 30 in the year 1247. Therefore, it was imperative to say your prayers, not because it brought comfort, but because hell was a terrifying prospect, and you did not want to arrive unannounced, unwashed, and spiritually unprepared. A well-known prayer was, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." It sounds sweet, does it not? Except it is fundamentally a legal contract drafted by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a probable outcome of going to bed. Many adults maintained a whole repertoire of prayers for various threats. One for when you felt guilty. One for when you suspected the devil might be lurking in the rafters. And one for plague prevention, which, regrettably, proved ineffective over time. Some even prayed to specific saints, renowned for watching over sleepers, akin to celestial bouncers guarding your soul at the entrance to a club. The truly pious monks, nuns, and excessively anxious nobles concluded their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. Following Compline, they would observe a vow of silence, which was not particularly difficult since their neighbors were likely asleep. People prayed before bed partly because it was beneficial for their souls, and partly because it gave them something to do besides wonder why the dog was in their bed again. Parents would remind their children that angels were observing them, a notion that sounds endearing until one realizes it was less about a guardian angel and more about a celestial surveillance network. In summary, pre-sleep prayer was less about attaining peace and more about last-minute damage mitigation. Consider it a form of medieval antivirus software. You hoped it was effective, even if you did not entirely comprehend its workings. In the contemporary world, dreams are frequently regarded as arbitrary nonsense, manifestations of stress, the result of too much cheese before bed, or simply your brain attempting to organize its files in the dark. In the medieval world, however, dreams were treated with extreme gravity, as in, with eternal consequences. Dreams were not mere dreams. They were perceived as messages. They could be from God, from saints, from the devil, from your guardian angel, or perhaps from that peculiar relic you kissed the previous Sunday. Some dreams were interpreted as divine revelations, while others were seen as demonic temptations. In either case, you were expected to pay close attention, possibly document it, confess it, or fast for 3 days as a precautionary measure. Theologians, monks, and self-declared visionaries dedicated an astonishing amount of time to the interpretation of dreams. Entire books were devoted to their decoding. A dream of fire might signify hell. A dream of water could represent purification, or it could mean drowning. A dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish. You had better summon a priest immediately, and perhaps consider relocating. Medieval people held the belief that events in dreams were significant because the soul remained active during sleep. This meant that your actions within a dream could expose hidden sins or spiritual vulnerabilities. That mildly embarrassing dream about purloining a loaf of bread, it might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony, or it could just be hunger. Still, it was wiser to confess it regardless, just in case. Monks and nuns frequently recorded their dreams and discussed them with their spiritual superiors. Some were acclaimed for experiencing holy visions in their sleep. Others were quietly advised to consume fewer onions before retiring. Naturally, dreams were not just spiritual enigmas. They also served as excellent narrative tools. Medieval literature is replete with dream sequences in which knights meet angels, demons, or allegorical creatures that recite poetry about virtue. Dreams were, in a sense, the Netflix of the medieval era, albeit with more allegory and fewer cheerful conclusions. The church, predictably, was wary. Not all dreams were of divine origin, and some were thought to be implanted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamed of something unwholesome, it could indicate that your soul was under assault, or it might just mean you slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some individuals allow their pets to sleep in their bed. It is a cozy, if occasionally odorous, custom. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal was not a matter of comfort. With stone walls, no insulation, and drafts so forceful they likely had names, central heating was known as the family pig. In peasant dwellings, it was not uncommon for humans and their livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, and frequently on the same pile of straw. Chickens roamed about freely, dogs curled up at one's feet, pigs snorted contentedly by the hearth, and if you were fortunate, none of them bit you in the night. This was not a display of affection, though medieval people certainly valued their animals. It was a matter of survival. Animals produce body heat. They were warm, reliable, and unlike certain relatives, did not monopolize the blanket. A large dog could prevent your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might elevate the room's temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a divine intervention. Medieval homes, particularly those of the lower classes, often consisted of a single room for all activities: cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes dying. Everyone, both human and animal, shared the same space. Children might be wedged between their parents and a goat. A chicken might act as an impromptu alarm clock. As for hygiene, it is best not to delve too deeply into that subject. For more affluent families, this practice was less common. Nobles did not typically sleep alongside their livestock, though they might still have lap dogs in their beds, not for warmth, but for fashion and the redistribution of fleas. Some castles even had designated sleeping quarters for favored animals, because nothing asserts power like a dog with its own room and a title. There were, of course, disadvantages. Animals can be noisy, they can wander, and they are not, by historical account, known for respecting personal boundaries. But medieval people learned to adapt. A hoof to the face at 3 a.m. was simply part of the nightly routine. If you have ever been compelled to share a room in a youth hostel and thought, "This is rather excessive," allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to perish quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries did not subscribe to the concepts of personal space, or softness, or, frankly, fun. The typical dormitory accommodated dozens of monks, all sleeping in a single large room, usually arranged in orderly rows like morally impeccable sardines. Their beds, if one could call them that, were often mere wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling particularly benevolent, or if it was a feast day. Monks slept fully clothed, not out of a sense of modesty, but because dressing in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more arduous than simply going to bed already prepared. The monastic habit, complete with robe, belt, and sandals, served as both spiritual armor and inadequate insulation. If you felt cold, you added more layers. If you felt hot, well, you did not. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no conversation. Silence was not merely suggested, it was enforced under the rule of Saint Benedict. If you turned over and groaned too audibly, you might find yourself assigned to chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, occupied a gray area. One could not control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might still deem you responsible, or at the very least, your cellmates would. Illumination was minimal, perhaps a single candle. You did not need to see, you only needed to lie still and avoid sinning. That was the objective. Despite this austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were a form of training for the afterlife, a preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any form of excess. Sleep was not a pleasure. It was a necessity, supervised and scheduled like all other aspects of their lives. Some monks even slept in a sitting position, just to steer clear of any hint of luxury, or dreams, or proper circulation. In comparison, the peasants' straw piles and the company of snoring pigs almost seem opulent. At least the pig did not pass judgment on you. Let us consider something that would appall most contemporary sleepers. Waking up voluntarily at 2 in the morning, not for a trip to the bathroom or to mindlessly scroll through a device, but for prayer, loud, cold, candlelit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was the standard procedure. Monks and nuns adhered to a strict daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the deepest part of the night, when even the owls were still contemplating whether to awaken. A bell would toll, often rung by someone who had drawn the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived individuals would proceed to the chapel in silence. And yes, they were still fully clothed, because monks did not wear pajamas. The only layering system they embraced was a spiritual one. Inside the chapel, illuminated by the flicker of candlelight and enveloped by the echoes of stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and do their utmost not to fall asleep while standing. This, incidentally, was a genuine problem. There are records of monks being disciplined for dozing mid-prayer, typically with extra chores or additional prayers. Did you fall asleep during matins? Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could extend for an hour or more. Some particularly zealous orders prolonged it to 2. Imagine attempting to remain spiritually present while your stomach reminds you that dinner consisted of a bowl of lentils and a moral lecture, and your body is actively trying to shut down. After the service, the monks would either return to bed for their second sleep, or, in more austere orders, proceed directly to study or manual labor, because nothing says holy discipline like thrashing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The purpose was to sacrifice comfort and to dedicate the first and most tranquil part of the night to God, free from the distractions of daylight, warmth, or REM cycles. It was a potent symbol of devotion, or at least it was once you overcame the numbness in your feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often depicted as a luxury, a symbol of independence, peace, or simply the ability to command the entire blanket. In the medieval world, however, sleeping alone was viewed as suspicious, impractical, or outright dangerous. Let us begin with the fundamentals. Warmth. Beds, as we have discussed, were not particularly warm environments. Stone walls and open chimneys did little to retain heat, and central heating was still several plagues in the future. Consequently, people shared beds for bodily warmth, not as an act of intimacy, but out of basic thermal necessity. Children slept with their siblings, parents, and sometimes a neighbor's child if they were visiting. It was akin to a sleepover, but no one asked for your consent to attend. Beyond warmth, however, there was a spiritual justification for sleeping in groups. Many believed that the night was when the devil was most active. Alone in the darkness, one's soul might be susceptible to temptation, or worse, demonic possession. Having others nearby established a kind of moral protective barrier. If something went awry, at least someone would be there to witness it, or perhaps to be possessed first. For children, being alone at night was almost inconceivable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all considered part of the nightly environment. Folktales warned that solitary sleep was a gateway to mischief and spiritual danger. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales did not conclude with hugs. They concluded with disappearances. Even married couples frequently shared their beds with children, servants, or unexpected guests. Privacy was not so much a concept as it was a modern invention. In fact, the notion of two people sleeping alone in a large bed was so foreign that it would have been regarded as either wasteful or profoundly suspicious. In religious settings, even monks often slept in communal arrangements. If someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was typically for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in some instances, being alone in bed was a literal form of punishment. The medieval logic was as follows: solitary sleep presents an opportunity for sin, while group sleep ensures public accountability. The next time you are nestled in your own bed with your own blanket, in a room that does not smell of goat, savor the silence. In medieval times, you would likely have 2 children, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you have ever inadvertently fallen asleep while sitting upright in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably awoke with a stiff neck and a profound sense of regret. In the Middle Ages, however, sleeping upright was not an accident. It was a way of life. Some medieval individuals, particularly the wealthy or the devoutly religious, opted to sleep in a propped-up position rather than lying flat. Why? There were few reasons, none of them especially conducive to restful sleep. Firstly, there was a medical belief that lying flat was detrimental to digestion, the lungs, or the overall equilibrium of the bodily humors. In a world where physicians believed a sneeze could reorder your soul, this reasoning was perfectly logical. Sleeping upright, they thought, helped to prevent congestion of the brain, which sounds alarming, but primarily meant avoiding drowning in your own phlegm. Secondly, there were spiritual anxieties. Lying flat was considered too similar to the posture of the deceased. You did not want to confuse God, or worse, attract the notice of the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Was this superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest also served as the community's health advisor, you learned to choose your battles wisely. As a result, people often slept in a partially reclined state, supported by large bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval armchair. Nobles sometimes had their beds equipped with angled supports to help them maintain a semi-seated posture, ideal for digesting their evening meat pie or repelling surprise demonic assaults. Monks took this practice a step further. In more austere orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench, leaning against a cold wall with only a hood to deaden the discomfort. This was not about health, it was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m., needless to say, this was not about achieving quality rest. It was about virtue, discomfort, and a somewhat bewildering theology. Forget about haunted dreams or goblins hiding under the bed. For medieval people, the true monsters of the night were already nestled in the sheets, small, relentless, and completely indifferent to your prayers. We are speaking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bed bug. Let us not try to soften the reality. Hygiene was not a strong point of medieval Europe. Baths were infrequent, laundering clothes was costly, and soap was sometimes concocted from substances best left unmentioned. Combine this with straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken wandering underfoot, and you have created the ideal setting for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so ubiquitous, they were practically considered roommates. Peasants contended with them on a daily basis. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not immune. In fact, some wealthier households employed dedicated nitpickers, actual servants, whose job it was to remove lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your professional title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bed bugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval slumber. They concealed themselves in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the crevices of stone walls, emerging at night to feast like minuscule vampires. If you have ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it was not always for warmth. Sometimes it was a form of pest defense armor. The solutions ranged from the moderately effective to the impressively bizarre. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to ward off bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in their beds, which may have had little effect on the pests, but certainly kept romantic encounters to a minimum. The issue was not just one of physical discomfort, either. Fleas were often viewed as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were composed about fleas, some of them moralizing, some strangely romantic. Because nothing says, "I love you," quite like, "Let us be united like the flea that bites us both." So, while modern sleep is disrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely to be disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle sensation that something was crawling on your shin. Because it was. We have all experienced restless nights. But have you ever attempted to fall asleep while encased in 100 pounds of iron? No. Well, in the Middle Ages, some individuals did precisely that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, did not routinely sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, and noisy. Attempting to roll over in a suit of chainmail is comparable to trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. However, during times of war or in hostile territories, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer option. Comfort was optional, survival was highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case the enemy decided to throw a surprise midnight party. There is nothing quite like being awakened by the sound of hooves and having to don the rest of your armor while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might even sleep with their swords or axes beside them, like very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields served as pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you would not have to get dressed. It was a matter of priorities. Of course, sleeping in armor was not exactly rejuvenating. Iron is not a breathable material, and chainmail has a notorious habit of pinching the skin. Add to that cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you have a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below an airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not engaged in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in perilous regions. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, thick, quilted jackets that offered a degree of protection and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. And let us not forget, armor was not exactly discreet. If you rolled over in the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else awoke and assumed the apocalypse had arrived. Again, in an era when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs in your bed were not considered out of the ordinary, you might think that sleepwalking would be just one more medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was treated with much more drama than that. In the Middle Ages, if you began to wander about in your sleep, people did not attribute it to stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had some unresolved business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking or noctambulation, if you wished to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and often feared. The notion that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare vacantly at a wall was less harmless parasomnia and more the devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the period suggest that people were genuinely frightened by sleepwalkers. Imagine this: a man in a long nightshirt holding a candle, his eyes glazed over, muttering Latin that he did not actually know while stepping over livestock. You would think ghost or heretic or both, and depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be arranged before breakfast. Some believed that sleepwalking was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, particularly an excess of black bile, which was the medieval catch-all explanation for anything they could not otherwise explain. Others thought it occurred because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to wander about like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly excursions, people tried everything from herbal remedies to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or, in more rural areas, simply tying the person's leg to a chair. If that seems extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives lying about, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned. In one peculiar twist, there were rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could commit a sin while unconscious. Fortunately, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone happened to sleepwalk into a church, the locals might interpret it as a divine sign or call for a cleansing ritual, just to cover all spiritual bases. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep amidst chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege for the sleep-deprived inhabitants of the Middle Ages. These were merely ambient sounds, the medieval equivalent of white noise. Let us begin with the bells. Church bells punctuated every sacred moment of the day: sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course, the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 in the morning. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were likely accompanied by the soundtrack of regular tolling. At some point, the brain simply adapted. The bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it was not just bells. Storms were frequent and frightening. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder as if the world might be ending. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees. Yet, people slept. They had to. Work did not pause for insomnia, and neither did plowing, praying, or fleeing from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events were not always a reason to stay awake either. In the 14th century, people somehow continued to sleep through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts passed by in the morning, it was considered more of a grim wake-up call than a cause for panic. And if you did not wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy. There are even accounts of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adjusted. If you labored from sunrise to sunset, consumed barely enough to survive, and spent your day evading mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep, and fall asleep hard. Then there were those who used sleep as a kind of escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or the fear that the world was literally ending, which was predicted roughly every century, some people would just curl up under a cloak, murmur a prayer, and take a nap. There is a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was enveloped in more than just snow. It was shrouded in tension, suspicion, and a quiet sort of fear that permeated the timber-framed houses and frozen fields. The residents of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and profoundly superstitious. They believed they were constructing a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already challenging. The village had recently separated from Salem town due to political and religious disputes. Crops had failed, smallpox had devastated nearby communities, and wars with Native American tribes had left many traumatized. There was friction between neighbors, disputes over inheritance, and a deep-seated resentment towards outsiders or anyone who did not quite conform. Add to this the long, dark, and bitter New England winter, and it was inevitable that something would break. That break occurred in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit strange behavior. They screamed uncontrollably, threw objects, and contorted their bodies in unnatural ways. At times, they would fall silent for hours, their eyes wide with terror. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, uncertain of how to proceed, summoned a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical explanation, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word ignited the fears that were already smoldering in Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. And now, if the devil could insinuate himself into the minister's own household, what did that portend for the rest of the community? The girls, prompted by both adults and their peers, began to name names. Initially, they accused women on the fringes of society, social misfits and outcasts. But soon, the accusations would extend to the respectable, the wealthy, and even the pious. Salem was a small village, but the events about to unfold would reverberate far beyond its borders. What started as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows, leaving a legacy of paranoia that still haunts the pages of American history. Once the notion of witchcraft took hold in Salem, it spread like a creeping vine, quietly at first, then suffocating everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow more audacious with each passing day. They would convulse in the courtroom, scream during prayers, and claim they could see dark spirits hovering over certain villagers. It was not mere childhood fantasy. It was theatrical, public, and most alarmingly, it was believed. The first to be accused were those with the least social protection, women who already existed on the periphery of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when she was turned away from doorways. People asserted that her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe. She was sharp with children. She fit the archetype of a witch because she did not fit the archetype of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne had not attended church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband's death. A woman who defied social conventions was clearly suspect. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, was the most foreign of them all. After intense questioning, she confessed, but instead of resolving the matter, her confession threw it wide open. She recounted a tale of a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, who had asked her to sign a book. She said she had seen strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs. But most damningly, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened that door, others eagerly rushed through. New names were added to the list weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. long-standing grudges were cloaked in righteous accusation. Property disputes transformed into spectral assaults. If someone's cow suddenly died, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's work. The fear became so contagious that even the innocent were afraid to speak out. To defend an accused witch was to invite suspicion upon oneself. Silence was the path to safety, and so the web of accusations expanded, ensnaring the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was receding. Hysteria was now in command. As accusations multiplied and the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial government intervened. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and keen to restore order, established a special court to address the chaos. It was named the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning to hear and determine. But what it truly became was a factory for fear-driven justice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its procedures were distorted by panic. Instead of demanding concrete evidence or credible witnesses, it permitted something far more perilous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form choking them in a dream, that was admissible in court. It mattered not that the accused might have been asleep at church or miles away. It was their spirit, they claimed, doing the devil's bidding. You could not cross-examine a dream, and worse, you could not disprove it. Children were now treated as principal witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court grew more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she would shriek. If they did not look at her, she would shriek louder. The performances were captivating, and the judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, were convinced. They saw the girl's torment not as a performance, but as proof of demonic assault. The trials became a terrifying cycle. The accused were presumed guilty from the start. You stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls would writhe in agony. If you confessed, you might be spared death, but only if you implicated others. The accused were brought into court in shackles, often bewildered, frequently poor, and almost always without power. And yet, not everyone was convinced. Some townspeople whispered that the girls were feigning their afflictions. Others questioned why only certain types of individuals were being accused. But few dared to speak openly. To question the court was to question the will of God. In Salem, reason had been set aside, and the law had become a mirror, reflecting not justice, but fear. On June 10th, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal. Her reputation made her a vulnerable target. She wore bright red clothing, operated a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years before. During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit had pinched them in the night, that their babies had died after she walked by, and that she possessed enchanted dolls. She denied everything. Nevertheless, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept piece of land just outside Salem. There was no prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled, the crowd watched, and with that single execution, the machinery of death began its inexorable churn. The hangings that followed came swiftly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of them had been in good standing with the church. The case of Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was shocking. She was an elderly, pious woman beloved in the community. Even the jury had initially found her not guilty. But under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Nurse's final words were whispered on the wind like a premonition. "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it made no difference. The noose did not discriminate. In August, more executions took place. On September 22nd, the deadliest day of the trials, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had voiced doubts about the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a different, more gruesome fate. Giles refused to enter a plea. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without one, resorted to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Stones were piled upon his chest, slowly and cruelly over the course of 3 days. His final words, as legend holds, were more weight. By the time the hysteria subsided, 19 people had been hanged. 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in jail while awaiting trial. Dozens had confessed falsely to save their own lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. While the executions captured public attention, hundreds of others languished in cramped, foul-smelling jails, awaiting a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small jail could not accommodate them all. Accused witches were held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and forgotten. Most of the accused were not witches or even social outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, and children whose only crime was having a dispute with the wrong person or owning land that someone else coveted. In many instances, personal vendettas disguised as divine justice fueled the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died. It must be witchcraft. Someone refused to lend a tool clearly. A curse was at play. A notable case was that of Mary Easty, the sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse. Easty was initially accused, then released due to a lack of evidence. But when the afflicted girls began to have renewed fits, she was rearrested just days later. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final petition to the judges, she pleaded not for her own life, but that they put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. She was hanged soon after. Another tragic case was that of Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. Following her mother's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated and, under duress, confessed to being a witch. Her responses, a mix of gibberish and fear, were taken as truth. She was imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When she was finally released, she was mentally broken, never fully recovering from the trauma. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband, John Proctor, would later be hanged, was found guilty and sentenced to die. Because she was pregnant, her execution was postponed. This delay likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials concluded. Accusations snowballed. Some of the accused confessed in desperation to avoid execution, then named others to divert suspicion from themselves. Entire families were drawn into the vortex: fathers, wives, daughters. No one was beyond reach. Meanwhile, the jails swelled beyond their capacity. Food was scarce, and disease spread. Some died while awaiting trial, lost in the legal limbo of paranoia. And still, new names were added to the list each week. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to speak your name. By the autumn of 1692, the spell of hysteria began to fracture, not because the court regained its senses, but because reality forced its way back in. The turning point arrived when the accusations grew too audacious. People who had once supported the trials suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of them. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, articulate, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That was all it took. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood on the gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed to be incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent. Some began to weep. Even the most hardened observers were shaken. Yet, the execution proceeded. That moment, however, planted a seed of doubt. Then came the accusation against Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the apex of the colony's social hierarchy. Phipps, already unsettled by growing criticism and chaos, finally took action. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had shifted. Ministers who had once been silent or complicit began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced the use of spectral evidence. It were better, he declared, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was a radical notion in a society that had, for months, believed the exact opposite. People who had once cheered at the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the appetite for more blood had waned. Too many respected figures were being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had started to see that this was not divine justice. It was madness. Confessions dried up. Some of the accusers recanted their stories. Others vanished from public view. And those who had previously shouted the loudest now lowered their gaze. The fear had not disappeared, but it had exhausted itself. The public craved stability. The officials wanted to save face. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to awaken from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage had already been done. By late 1692, the judicial system that had propelled the hysteria began to crumble under the weight of its own absurdity. With the Court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, a new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established in early 1693. This time, the proceedings were different. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible, and the judges were noticeably more skeptical of the accuser's dramatic claims. As a result, the rate of convictions slowed dramatically. Many of the accused were acquitted. The girls, who had once held the power to condemn, with a single shriek, found that their performances had lost their persuasive force. The most prominent case in the unraveling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the mere fact that such a high-ranking, devout man could be suspected highlighted just how arbitrary and corrupt the process had become. The court, once ferocious, was now wary. Meanwhile, the families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. In time, communal shame replaced communal fear. Church congregations fractured. Friendships were severed. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been shredded. Governor Phipps, recognizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came at a cost. Many families had to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged. 1 had been pressed to death. 5 had died in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court did not just collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but the healing had not even begun. Salem was a village forever altered by the people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows were silent. The jails had emptied, but Salem was far from peaceful. The town was not haunted by ghosts, but by guilt. What had commenced with a handful of ailing girls had escalated into a communal act of destruction. Families had been shattered, reputations ruined, and innocent lives extinguished. And now, the survivors had to navigate the wreckage. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. The same individuals who had once prayed together had testified against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly departed from the town. Others receded from the public sphere. A few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later express remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, attributing her actions to a delusion by Satan. But for many, the harm was beyond reparation. The court officials, too, bore their burden. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was one of the few to admit his wrongdoing. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read his confession aloud, asking for forgiveness from both God and the community for his part in the shedding of innocent blood. The families of the condemned began demanding compensation. Over the years, petitions inundated the Massachusetts government, requesting official pardons, the return of property, and a public acknowledgement that the executed were innocent. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered limited financial restitution to their heirs. Yet, even this was not comprehensive. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were omitted entirely. Whispers of witchcraft never completely vanished from New England, but in Salem, the shame became an integral part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps in an attempt to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory of what had transpired. But the memory endured in sermons, in stories, and in the silence between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, and by unchecked power. And that curse would linger long after the executions had ceased. The Salem witch trials concluded more than 3 centuries ago, yet their legacy continues to resonate, not just in textbooks and historical tour, but in how we comprehend justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. The events of 1692 were not merely a peculiar episode of mass hysteria. They represented a breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners simply by believing too readily and questioning too little. The courts, intended to protect the innocent, became instruments of oppression. Religion was weaponized, testimony devolved into theater, and silence was equated with guilt. One of the most chilling aspects of Salem's tragedy is the speed at which it unfolded. In a matter of months, fear triumphed over fact. Long-held grudges, disguised as spiritual warfare, became death sentences. It did not require demons or devils. It only required a belief in them. But the trials also imparted hard-won lessons that would ripple through American society. In the years and centuries that followed, the Salem episode would be cited repeatedly in debates concerning due process and civil liberties. The U.S. Constitution, drafted nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit practices like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder measures that had, in effect, doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantees of a right to legal counsel, the right to confront one's accusers, and the requirement for concrete evidence were hard-won principles forged, in part, from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become a shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it is often used with little regard for the real terror those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: fear, when unchecked, can become its own form of tyranny. And when fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials serve as a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can falter when fear is granted authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile. Justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself unless we remember. In the final, tumultuous decades of the Roman Republic, power was a brutal and fluid commodity. Into this volatile world was born a woman who would not just witness history, but actively shape it: Fulvia. She hailed from the Fulvii, an ancient and powerful plebeian noble family that had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Her lineage was one of command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been immersed in the sharp-edged world of Roman authority. Senators and generals debated policy within her home. Elections and treachery were daily topics of conversation. She would have observed how politics was conducted not just in the forum, but through marriages, funerals, rumors, and clandestine deals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would defy all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and well-connected, and she was acutely aware of it. While the details of her early life remain obscure in the historical record, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically astute, and utterly fearless. This was not someone who would fade into the background. She possessed a strong personality, a sharp political intellect, and a determination to act, even within the male-dominated sphere of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unraveling. Civil wars, populist uprisings, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia came of age right in the midst of it. Rather than shrink from the chaos, Fulvia would learn to harness it. Her early life did not merely prepare her for marriage, it prepared her for war. She would marry 3 powerful men, each a radical figure in Roman history. But Fulvia would not just marry into power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome was not prepared for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, one of the most infamous and disruptive figures of the late Republic. Clodius was a populist rabble-rouser, a master of street politics who used organized gangs to intimidate his opponents in the Senate. He was an aristocrat by birth, but he renounced his patrician status to become a tribune of the plebs, a position he used to champion radical reforms. To the Senate, he was a dangerous demagogue. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, which took place sometime before 60 BCE, was a political alliance as much as a personal one. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, was right there beside him. She was not a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political world. She engaged with his supporters, was visible during his campaigns, and managed their household as a hub for Clodian politics. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But the alliance came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome, but Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, his bloodied wounds exposed for maximum effect. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had transformed personal grief into a public uprising. Her calculated, theatrical display of mourning and her ability to wield her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadows, and Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia did not linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama, but beneath the bravado was a sharp political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered between war and peace, between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia's marriage to Curio was a shrewd move. It allowed her to maintain her influence within the populist faction, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's side. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba, I of Numidia. His death was brutal, and his army was annihilated. Once again, Fulvia was widowed, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into the background. She did not. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political widow with dangerous resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and both had died fighting for populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter were still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, was not merely a romantic attachment. It was a merger of power. Fulvia had already proven herself a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, needed that kind of savvy support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could defend his interests, hold his alliances together, and rally supporters when he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise authority that no Roman woman had publicly wielded before. She opened his correspondence. She issued orders in his absence. She sat in on meetings and influenced appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile, depicted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what disturbed them most was not her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, but it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized. She even helped arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Claudia, to him, an alliance that would later implode. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his proxy. Roman coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status. She was not hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full glare. But power in Rome was always borrowed, and Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She was not just his wife, she was his regent in all but name. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome, in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, was a battlefield without swords. Power had become a moving target. While Antony was away, Fulvia managed his political and financial interests with an iron grip. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to maintain public order, and ensured that any legislation passed favored Antony's future. Some ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies a woman actively engaged in politics. in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. She cultivated relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning in the East, Fulvia was often the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and reminding the soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They viewed her as a meddling woman with too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented. Fulvia was not naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing. She could see that their alliance was cracking, and she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic was not big enough for both of them. So Fulvia began preparing for the next phase, not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now, she was ready to take it into her own hands. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, and she did not do it quietly. With her husband, Mark Antony, still stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The cause, ostensibly, it was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusian War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced many Italians to reward his soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius acting as her frontman in the Senate and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perusia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred the public, and even corresponded with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders, and forcing Lucius into action when he wavered. The historian Cassius Dio claimed that Fulvia had the last say in everything, and was managing affairs of state no less than the consuls. Octavian, a master of propaganda, portrayed Fulvia as an unhinged, power-mad woman who was emasculating her brother-in-law. But this was more than a personal feud. It was a strategic, if desperate, move to check Octavian's rising power before he became unstoppable. For a few months, it seemed Fulvia might succeed, but Octavian's military machine was superior. He laid siege to Perusia, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, stuck between dwindling food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a gesture to avoid alienating Antony. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony did not come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before, wage a civil war. And now, the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had gone to war, not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. She believed she was defending Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and perhaps their shared vision of Rome. But what awaited her in exile was not a hero's welcome. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything, her status, her alliances, her life. And yet Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had begun or was merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he let her hang out to dry. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Perusian War without his direct approval. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never tolerated. Still, Fulvia was not entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her, urged reconciliation, but her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness, stress, or heartbreak, or all three. She was around 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth eclipsed nearly every Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She did not wield power from behind a curtain. She marched into it, stood at the center, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as furniture. Rome did not know what to do with her, so it erased her. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, the men she had once maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet work of rewriting her legacy. She could not defend herself, so the narrative was shaped by her enemies and the uneasy survivors of her ambition. And like so many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly penned by men with vested interests, painted her as the reason for the Perusian War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general disorder of the Republic. Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by a lust for power. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for antagonizing Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated within a political climate where violence and manipulation were expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. Her only true deviation was that she was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome did not know how to digest that. She was not cloistered in the home, weaving quietly or serving as a political ornament. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and commanding loyalty from troops. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic cleansing. Her memory became the price of his political survival. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral, no mourning speeches in the Senate, just silence. Yet her enemies could not erase her entirely. Fulvia had done too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a deity or metaphor, but as a political agent. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men. Fulvia defied every Roman expectation of what a woman was supposed to be. She did not just advise power from the shadows, she became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispers and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was not a consort, she was a commander. And yet, she was remembered more for her defiance than her accomplishments. Roman historians could not handle a woman who did not stay in her place, so they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But read between the lines, and a different figure emerges. A woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall was not due to incompetence. It was due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though of a different world, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer a cautionary tale, she is being recognized as one of the most politically active women in Roman history, someone who tested the boundaries of female power and paid the price. She did not simply live in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote, but a force. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a nation teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression, and another aching to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation was not just a social norm, it was the law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant. Lynchings still occurred, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it was not asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names, they were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington was not born out of a single conversation. It was the result of rising frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C., had been circulating for decades. A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they were not just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it, despite their many disagreements, because they understood the power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized, flyers printed, and speeches drafted for what would become one of the most iconic moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was no small feat, but planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was madness. Logistically, It sounded like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans. And yet, somehow, they made it happen. The chief architect of this monumental undertaking was Bayard Rustin, a brilliant, tireless, and often overlooked figure in the movement. Rustin was a master strategist. He had once studied nonviolence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled by the FBI. But nothing fazed him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed the idea into a reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby. Hospitals in D.C. were put on alert, and liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home. And then there was the question of unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics. Some wanted more radical action, others more diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach. But they all agreed on this. The time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute. And every route had marshals trained in crowd control. They were not just planning a march. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28th, 1963. A sweltering Wednesday in Washington. D.C., the sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. But it did not stop them. From every corner of the country they came. Black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best, others clutched protest signs. They came by bus, train, carpool, and even on foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic, the Red Cross handed out water, and groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of jobs and freedom, echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in, too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this was not just a protest, it was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the Mall felt like a quiet act of revolution, to be seen, to be counted, to say, "We are here, in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone." It was a full circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideologies, and regions, but united in their message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. As the hours passed, the tension grew not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march was not just making history, it was becoming legend, minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember was not what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence not as fillers, but as instruments. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event, and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he had delivered before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute. "I have a dream that one day, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It was not a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," he was not just speaking to the crowd in front of him. He was speaking to generations, yet to come. The speech had become prophecy. The power of the March on Washington was not just in the speeches or the music, it was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks, who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses. They did not just want change, they were the change. There were also children in the crowd, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speakers' voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this was not just an event. It was the beginning of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising, that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They did not all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences did not matter. Unity won out. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity. Freedom Now buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd were not just watching history unfold, they were shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was, in truth, held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics, but politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King did not remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of the planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all, but she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay the truth. The movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too important, just for one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing of the sort happened, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. And let us not forget the money. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. Just like the country it sought to heal, the sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised high. The world had watched. And now, the question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was code for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That, at least, could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward. But legislative movement remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the claws of Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that reality hit hard. On September 15th, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare was not over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before: labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world. The march was over, but the road was just beginning, and that road would soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington did not just rattle the conscience of America, it reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective moral witness. The most immediate and tangible results were legislative. In July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from a respected leader to a global icon. But fame came with a cost: surveillance, threats, and ultimately, assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it inspired a generation of activists, both in the U.S. and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy is not just historical. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I Have a Dream," still pulse through modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign. In Washington, D.C., King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone, with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial is not in stone. It is in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to stay silent. Because the dream was not meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon, when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and strong, echoes in the national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question remains: has the dream been realized, or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle. And yet, the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain entrenched. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color, is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past, but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again, until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality.